Hello, Bravs. We return with So the Witch Won't Eat Me, Fantasy and the Child's Fear of Infanticide by Dorothy Bloch. We move now to chapter 4, I believe. I didn't come out of my mother's stomach, a fantasy that took 3 years to evolve. Until a child enters treatment, the extraordinary function of his fantasies rarely become evident. It is not unusual for a child to reveal during his first session a fantasy that he may then play out for the next 2 or 3 years, that he is involved in a question of life or death, and with the analyst's help is proceeding toward the resolution of the fantasy he has created in order to defend himself against his terror, may not emerge until the fantasy's actual denouement. That the process may take years tells us something about the nature of feelings. Once they are established, it is no easy matter to dislodge or to modify them. In handling the fantasy in psychoanalytic treatment, the analyst takes his cues from the child. Since the child has created the fantasy in order to defend himself, it appears essential to respect his right of authorship and to leave the work in his hands. Unless he adopts a destructive course, I have found it most important to leave the initiative to him, even when he insists that the analyst assume the lead. His proven reliability in creating a fantasy to meet his needs seems to indicate that if he is allowed to remain in charge of it, he may be able to resolve it with the analyst's help. It is characteristic of work with children's fantasies that they may frequently appear to proceed without any discernible direction until their actual resolution reveals the master plan. Very often, only in retrospect does the progress of the fantasy become clear. The climax itself may come as a surprise and may suddenly illuminate an activity that has extended over several years, although the analyst may often feel at sea. If he simply takes the cues and adopts the lines offered by the child, he may later find that he has advanced the fantasy from one stage to the next. In instances where the child's ability to fantasize appears constricted for any reason, once the child has set the guidelines, the analyst may liberate and enrich the fantasy by simply elaborating on what the child has set forth, always mindful of not usurping the child's role. Where there is any doubt about the usefulness of the child's occupation, his functioning in reality is usually an excellent barometer of the validity of the analyst's handling of the treatment situation. In the case of 5-year-old Jose, the fantasy of a secret identity, which he revealed during his first session, reached its climax after 3 years of treatment. Although I had already had intimations of its presence, the dramatic session that finally proclaimed his true identity was impressive, not only because of the suddenness of the culmination of an extraordinarily slowly devolving fantasy, but because of the speed with which the revelation of his real self was followed by a rapprochement with the more threatening parent. "I'm not an American," he volunteered at our first meeting. "I didn't come out of my mother's stomach like my sister Mary." "Where did you come from?" I asked. Jose became vague and distracted, maybe from inside my aunt, although that information was to remain my frame of reference throughout Jose's treatment. I was not to learn its true meaning until the climax of his fantasy. The extraordinary scale of the feeling of rejection implied by the theory of his birth was immediately clear. It took almost 3 years, however, to discover that "I'm not an American" did not mean merely being different or alien. Since he was convinced his father wanted to kill him, he assumed he must belong to the group of people his father had killed in the war, the Germans. His fantasy of an assumed identity defended him against his fear of infanticide by explaining and justifying his father's murderous feelings toward him and providing the hope that when he changed and became an American, his father would love him. The process that led Jose to his true identity was as devious as one might expect of someone who had found himself living in the camp of the enemy almost from birth. Only after the battles he devised had culminated in the slaughter of the Americans did Jose feel strong enough to claim equal status with his father. The immediacy with which that assertion followed the resolution of the central theme of his fantasy was startling in itself, and without precedent in my experience. Once again, the unerring direction of a fantasy established the extraordinary reliability of the psyche in the fight for survival. Although my psychoanalytic treatment of children had already led me to expect a disclosure of core problems, frequently during the first session, very little in my interview with Jose's parents had prepared me for his initial disclosure, and I was taken aback. In retrospect, I realized that his mother had certainly suggested the basis for his feeling that she preferred his sister, although not for its dimensions. Nothing in his father's communication, however, had given the slightest indication that Jose lived in daily fear of extermination by him. My first interview with them had left me somewhat confused. I recall thinking afterward, could it be that at last a child is being referred who doesn't need help? I had heard such a phenomenon reported by others, but had never encountered it in my own practice. I had finally concluded that if a parent thinks a child needs help, it's a safe assumption that he does. In this instance, however, I had some doubt, and to my credit, I felt that my very question suggested something suspicious in the situation. It was mainly his father's exultant laughter as he spoke of Jose that kept me wondering. He was an extraordinarily charming man in his early 30s, tall and slender, with light brown hair and blue eyes, a former cabinet maker who had become a successful manufacturer of furniture. He had come here from Argentina in late adolescence and had met and married his Spanish wife a few years later. He commenced by announcing he was merely indulging her by consenting to what he called a preventive interview, and asserted with conviction that he had a very happy relationship with his son, whom he presented as a paragon. At 5, Jose had mastered all the skills that were expected of him and more. He was a leader among children and easily won their admiration. His creative gifts were a joy to both parents. Jose was an artist. Let me grab this book. Wrist is killing me holding this. He was an artist who was capable of losing himself in the contemplation of a cloud. Was that neurotic? The wife, somewhat rounder but as tall as her husband and with darker coloring, appeared tense and unsmiling and somewhat intimidated in his presence. She immediately conceded over concern and perhaps mismanagement. Nevertheless, it began with, butchering this. She immediately conceded over concern and perhaps mismanagement. Nevertheless, it seemed to her there was something that merited attention. To begin with, Jose's artistic temperament was such a source of exasperation to her that it ruined their relationship. Just the night before, it had taken him 2 hours to get undressed, bathed, and ready for bed. The same difficulty occurred every morning in preparing for school, or whenever there was a time deadline, whenever there was a I can't frickin' read. She felt that it had all started with the birth of their infant daughter, Mary, toward whom Jose had a punitive attitude, although at times he also seemed affectionate. There had been a great deal of tension between her and her husband at the time of Jose's birth. It seemed to her now that she had been too strict with him, and she recognized how relaxed she felt with Mary, to whom both of them responded much more easily. And then there were certain peculiarities in Jose that she couldn't dismiss. After Mary's birth, he had started to suck his thumb almost constantly. That had lasted a month and had been followed in succession by masturbation. Oh my gosh. Pretty sure that is sort of an involuntary thing in little children. Coughing, and finally by blinking. She also reported in an apologetic way, as though not quite sure of her ground, that Jose loved the feel of hair, that he was constantly touching it. It seemed exaggerated. There were also very occasional outbursts of rage, like a dam breaking. Her husband laughed at her presentation so that she faltered and seemed almost ready to erase it. Only much later did I realize that her husband's performance was so convincing that had almost succeeded in blurring for me what I recognized as a familiar symptomatology. I had no difficulty in engaging the degree of terror that might be required for a child to adopt covert means to express opposition or to employ compulsive acts to repress rage. Only after I had grasped the scale of the deception employed by Jose's father, however, could I marvel at the skill that made me question for a moment the need for help established by his wife. As I discovered from subsequent sessions, Jose's father deceived not only me, but himself. The happy relationship was obviously a myth or a fantasy that soon proved a formidable barrier to his continued involvement in his son's treatment. As I became acquainted with his parents, I came to know that it was Jose's misfortune that he reminded not only his father of a hated younger brother, but also his mother of a hated older one. When Jose's mother arrived at the distressing discovery that she didn't enjoy Jose because she always expected him to defeat her, she was soon able to trace that feeling to her older brother, with whom she had been in constant conflict as a child. For Jose's father, however, that early relationship had been too traumatic to approach. His mother had died when he was quite young, and as he was approaching adolescence, his father had married a woman who bore him another son. That son was adored, whereas he himself was ignored and made into a workhorse. He had left his father's house in rebellion and did not see his brother again for many years, and then only briefly, so that his memory of him remained fixed as just about Jose's age. Jose's birth had very likely revived that experience and made him the focus of the rivalry and the murderous hostility that belonged to the earlier relationship. Although Jose's father was never verbalized any hostile or competitive feelings towards him, his rivalry with his son led him into an unconscious analytic contest with him, despite his intense opposition to analysis. Instead of focusing on his relationship with Jose, he soon launched into a description of his own life, of his early years, and of the hardships he had to overcome, in a manner that was unusual under those circumstances. His wife also reported, with some embarrassment, that at Jose's birthday party he had competed with the children and had tried to show them up. It was also from her that I learned of an incident that dramatized his impact on Jose. Jose had spent an afternoon in the park with his father. When he returned and his mother asked him about the day, Jose had stated that it would have been better if he hadn't been so thirsty. She was puzzled, but asked if there wasn't any water in the park. Jose's expression was one of abject misery. It hadn't occurred to him that he might, or as she implied, dared ask his father if he could get a drink. Although Jose's response to the violent feelings of both parents became the warp and the wolf of his analysis, his ability to resolve the fantasy that dominated it for 2 years was a measure not only of the growth of his ego strength and the improvement in his way of relating to them, but also of their ability to change. They had both been brought up in violent households and accepted violence as a method of control. It is therefore not surprising that the scale of the terror induced by Jose's perception of their feelings placed him outside his mother's womb and transformed him into an enemy alien. That they were also caring people, however, was clearly established by their concern and their willingness to respond to his newly defined needs. For the first few minutes after I met Jose, I remembered his father's exulting laughter. Jose was a big fellow for his 5 years, a little heavy, but a delight to the eye. His extraordinary head, whose form was accentuated by its light brown, close-cropped hair, his serious face so filled with intelligence and wonder, and a skin coloring that seemed to have been arrived at by mixing sunlight and golden sand, brought to mind his mother's reports of strangers who were frequently moved to admire and caress him, much to Jose's annoyance. He was impressively self-sufficient, ignoring me and immediately concentrating on the possibilities offered by the playroom. He set about creating one of the most beautiful collages out of shells and colored glitter I had seen there. In the process, he spoke little. Finally, he volunteered what I suspected was his central preoccupation, the mystery of his identity. From the first, Jose struck me as a child whose only solution for such formidable enemies was to retreat and hide. Only covert opposition was possible, only devious methods of warfare. He appeared to maintain a sense of safety and control magically by excluding adults from his line of vision. For months, as soon as I opened the door to let him in, he rushed past me down the long hallway to the playroom, looking to neither right nor left, greeting me either inaudibly or not at all. You don't like to say hello? I commented one day. I did say hello, but you didn't hear it, he replied defensively. You don't have to if you don't want to, I assured him. But I did, he insisted. Jose rarely laughed or smiled, and for the most part maintained an expressionless mask. He spoke in low tones, sometimes measured, sometimes running together in a way that made it difficult to understand. He moved very quietly and appeared to avoid looking at me. This resulted in me. Jesus. This resulted in my looking at him. And I wondered if that was also his intent. During the first few weeks, he continued to ignore me and occupied himself mainly with drawing, making no attempt to involve me in any way. Apart from his original disclosure, his communication remained very guarded. The dreaminess that repeatedly moved his mother to rage and that his father ascribed to an artistic temperament appeared to be an ingenious defense, protecting him by its ambiguity. I suspected his pretense of not noticing me was part of it, but it manifested itself more clearly at the end of the session as a covert method of control. It's time to stop, I announced, allowing several minutes leeway, but Jose seemed preoccupied and gave no sign of having heard. When he finally arose from the table, he appeared absorbed in the contemplation of a drawing and then began an intense examination of a toy that he had ignored until then. You find it very difficult to leave, I attempted further, but with the same lack of success. Finally, by the third or fourth session, I came up with, I think we'll stop 10 minutes earlier so that you can take your time leaving. Jose was impressed. Did you leave 10 minutes today? He asked innocently at the end of the next session, all the while maneuvering to make it 15. I decided there was nothing for it but a direct confrontation. I've been noticing that you do at the end of every session. I've been noticing what you do. I just simply can't read right now. I observed, as soon as I say it's time to stop, you become very busy. I continued, imitating him. You suddenly begin to study this and to study that. You're so absorbed that you don't know what's going on. That's what you'd like me to think, but you know very well what's going on. You just don't want to budge. You're just a big fake, I charged. At first, Jose appeared to listen with deaf ears. Then a broad grin spread across his face until finally he let out a delightful laugh at the picture I drew. The first I had heard. It marked the beginning of a loosening up of his relationship to me and the first expression of a sense of humor that was increasingly liberated as his treatment progressed. The problem of his dilatory tactics was not wholly solved, however, but thereafter centered mainly on getting his coat on. His resourcefulness in dividing this seemingly simple operation into various stages, first assembling the garment in front of him, then treating each sleeve as a separate area of conquest, never failed to astound me. Let's have a race, I announced one day in desperation. I bet you can't get your coat on before I straighten my desk. But he won, and that eventually ended that oppositional maneuver. Jose's demeanor was unusually correct. Occasionally he inquired whether certain acts were permissible, but more often he acted as his own censor, and really He even expressed the wish to go beyond very decorous forms of conduct. He ignored all the toys, including the guns and soldiers, which might have encouraged some freedom of expression. Even his drawings were mainly static descriptions of buildings, bridges, and cars. When he wasn't drawing, he seemed at a loss for an activity. Once he brought some silly putty which clearly challenged his controls. It gave him a great deal of pleasure, but only within the careful limits he permitted. As far as I was aware, his dreaminess was the only conscious expression of his rebellion against the need for rigid compliance. In order to create a sense of safety, the dimensions of the rage engendered by the hostility of his environment appeared to require an additional unconscious defense whose objective was the massive repression of feelings. His mother had referred briefly to earlier compulsions, but I soon discovered they were a constant element in his behavior. When he first came to see me, he repeatedly cleared his throat. After a while, that stopped, only to be replaced by his smelling every object he used, sometimes shamefacedly, as though recognizing that there was something strange in it. The smelling then gave way to licking. His tongue had to make contact with every object he handled. He could no longer conceal at that point the discomfort of this activity nor the helplessness he experienced in the throes of it. By that time I had established enough of a relationship for him to be able to talk about it. Sometimes I said, "You don't really want to lick, but you can't help yourself. You feel forced to do it." He looked at me, half embarrassed, half appealing. "My tongue feels sore," he admitted. That was probably the most intense and uncomfortable compulsion he developed, and also the last one. As his feelings were liberated, he no longer required that defense. Fantasy became the dominant instrument that led to its resolution. During the entire first year of treatment, however, he allowed it to surface only once and permitted me a glimpse of the inner world that dictated his need for the extraordinary repression he maintained by means of compulsive acts. One lovely day in the late fall, he allowed himself to yield to the temptations of the terrace for the first time. "Can we go outside?" he asked. He looked about him, wandered aimlessly, then spotted the hose. "Can I turn it on?" he inquired. He did so, full force, and proceeded after a few minutes to aim it with unusually concentrated attention at a circumscribed area of the quarried tile roof. "It looks like a flood," I ventured, suspecting that murderous feelings were involved. "It is a flood," he exulted. What's getting flooded?" I pursued. "The whole city," he cried on a note of triumph. Pointing to the cracks, he added, "Those are the streets." "What streets are they? I guess they could not be too far from home." "That's 8th Avenue, and that's 22nd Street, and here's Broadway." "Where's West End?" I asked, wondering where I was in the fantasy. "That's a way over. The flood hasn't reached it yet." Then I mentioned his street. "Underwater," was the unhesitating reply. "And what's happening to the people?" "They're getting drowned," he jubilated. The flood remained a gratifying, although occasional, part of his activity. The theme of murder and annihilation was picked up in his drawings, which began to concern themselves exclusively with soldiers, guns, and warfare. It also gradually dominated his play, which was soon structured around soldiers and guns, and spilled over into his model making with its exclusive concentration on fighter planes, battleships, and tanks. Except for occasional excursions into board games and one domestic interlude, these activities lasted about 2 years and reflected in their development the various stages of his emotional growth and of the resolution of his fantasy of an assumed identity in response to his fear of infanticide. The slowness with which this world unfolded confounds belief in its almost imperceptible movement, and it suggested that suggested what one might imagine the waking process to be for someone who had slept for many years. Sometimes I was tempted to intervene with the hope of speeding things up, and sometimes I was successful. In general, however, Jose needed to take his own time to be allowed to let the process flow without interference. For some time, his play appeared to be internalized. Its paucity of movement or sound created the impression that he was thinking most of it. Among his first tentative efforts was a game he devised with two little cars he brought from home. He transformed the tabletop into a street, using some jars of paint and a box of chalk as props. Taking one car and giving me the other, he proceeded to move it slowly across the surface, directing me to do the same with mine from the opposite direction. And that was it. There was no sound, no contact, only the unhurried motion of each car as it followed the path across the table. Its monotony was matched only by his contentment with it. As I watched his silent, seemingly uneventful play, I cast about for some way of bringing his feelings to the surface and welcomed the opportunity he provided when, after several sessions, he announced that his was a police car. I immediately became a reckless driver, disobeyed all the traffic rules, and argued endlessly when he brought me to a halt. At first, he found great difficulty in verbalizing his role and smiled self-consciously as he replied in my provocations, which frequently moved him to laughter, timidly imposing light fines and a very mild threat of jail if I didn't mend my ways. It took many weeks before he developed any assurance in this role. Whenever I dropped mine, however, the game again became seemingly dull and uneventful. The law, order, and discipline imposed by terror were deeply entrenched and too formidable for Jose to challenge at that point. After some months in treatment, he also became interested in making models, a complicated activity for someone who did not yet know how to read, and at this stage he selected them indiscriminately. He studied the diagrams and the parts and did an amazing job of putting them together. There were moments, nevertheless, when he was clearly stuck. After watching him struggle silently for some minutes, I commented, "You don't like to ask for help, buddy." There was no response. After I tried several variations, including sometimes when people asked me, I can help them, he finally acceded. Nothing had seemingly been established, however, and the next problem was tackled in the identical manner. This time, however, I tried another tack and asserted with some vigor, "You don't really expect any help from me." His unhesitating reply cleared up the mystery. "Women don't know very much," he stated. He had already made known his position on the relative virtues of the sexes when he presented an apparently indisputable argument. If a family was in a boat and one of them was a girl, it would probably sink. To his credit, be it said, his illustration was accompanied by laughter. And I'm going to end there because I'm about halfway through and I don't plan to read this entire damn chapter. Too long. Especially with my miserable presentation tonight, so let's stop here. Goodbye, bruv. Goodbye.